Hey, how's it going, everybody? Shaun here from Zoobox, and today we're going to be talking about Paul Schrader's 1982 film Cat People. It's written by Alan Ormsby, based on a story by DeWitt Bowden, and then heavily rewritten by Paul Schrader himself. Even though he doesn't actually have a credit, he actually went in and did a lot of work on the story and kind of morphed it and changed it into something more to his liking, I guess. It stars Natasha Kinski, Malcolm McDowell, John Hurd, Annette O'Toole, Ruby Dee, Ed Begley Jr., and Frankie Faison. It is the description is: a young woman's sexual awakening brings horror when she discovers her urges transform her into a monstrous black leopard. So this movie is kind of a remake, kind of a spiritual remake. It really doesn't have much to do with the original movie. The original movie was produced by Val Lewton in 1942, and it's kind of known just for its mood and its tone, its atmosphere. It's not really a monster movie per se. It's more of kind of like a psychological drama horror movie. And this movie, what Paul Schrader did is he kind of went and took some of the concepts, some of the thematic elements, the subtext of the old movie, and made it literal. This is a story about people that literally turn into a black leopard. And it has to do with sex. Whenever they have sex with somebody that's outside of their own family, actually. It's got kind of this incest through line about it. Because it's kind of like this idea that there's this ancient race of people that are like half cat, half people, and they're kind of like mystical, and there's some kind of magical element to them, and that stuff's really only hinted on. You really kind of deal more with the story in the immediate. You know, it's a contemporary story. It does take place in 1982, around the time it was made, and it goes through the process of kind of telling a story about I guess what would I say? It's kind of like a feminist movie a little bit. It's got this idea of like sexual awakening and kind of your animal nature and what drives people to want to, I don't know, like survive in a kind of a genetic sense, in a legacy sense. What does it mean to survive? What does it mean to be of a people? And can you break tradition? Can you break with tradition? Can you get out of the box that you're put in because of what you're born into? That's kind of the broad strokes of the thematic elements of the story. The story itself, in the movie itself, this was the first time I'd ever seen it. Maybe if I would feel differently if I watched it again, but I thought it was just okay. I am kind of a fan of Paul Schrader. I mean, even as a writer, going back to the 70s, you know, he wrote Taxi Driver. As a director, he's been a little bit more hit or miss. He started out, what was the first movie he directed? I can't remember the first movie. I know the second movie he directed was Hardcore with George C. Scott, which is kind of what the movie 8mm was slightly based on, if you've ever seen the film 8mm. And he did American Gigolo, and he's done a bunch of stuff recently. Most recently, he made a really great movie called First Reformed, starring Ethan Hawke. It's a really great kind of psycho thriller that deals with like kind of existential dread and whatnot. So he's more interested, I think, in these more universal human philosophical questions. And Cat People definitely has that element to it. And he wanted to do it kind of in a more literal fashion. If it reminds me of a movie, it reminds me of actually the 90s movie with Jack Nicholson and Michelle Pfeiffer, Wolf. A lot of parallels to that movie in terms of what it has to say about the characters and what they're experiencing and what that means for you as a person. Because it just literalizes the subtext of the story, or the metaphor of the story. It just becomes real. And there's some interesting stuff. I think once the movie goes on, like especially the third act, it picks up a lot of steam, but it's kind of a slog to get there. You have a bunch of characters that are kind of not that interesting, and they're not really given the time or the material to really develop into people that you might even say you cared about. I was kind of struggling to stay invested in the movie for a lot of it. But even though it's got some really interesting stuff, it's got some great production design. It's shot really well and interestingly. It's shot kind of like a gothic horror thriller. and it even has a few like kind of slasher elements to it in the way that they shoot some of the violent scenes. Malcolm McDowell plays the main character's brother, Natasha Kinski's brother, and he's also one of these cat people. And they kind of lost touch over the years, and she comes into New Orleans, and he gives her a place to stay. But basically, he's kind of grooming her for her potential, for her future. Because apparently once you have your sexual awakening, or once you hit like, some kind of like rite of passage or puberty or whatever you want to call it, you start turning into a cat. And like I said, it's tied to the idea of having kind of casual sex, about it being kind of this animalistic hunt, this predatory experience. And it's almost like a defensive mechanism for this race of people, where they reflexively turn into cat people based on kind of violating their culture's social and sexual mores. So it's got a lot of interesting stuff in there. There's a lot of interesting stuff to explore thematically. It just doesn't ever feel like it finds the right balance, and the story doesn't have enough. I don't know. It's just like the characters are so bland, and the story doesn't, like I said, doesn't invest you enough in their plight as just human beings. It doesn't do a good enough job of building out who they are as people. So it feels all kind of functional, just a way to kind of talk about these concepts without talking about them, and they don't feel like real people. They don't feel like real human beings, and as the story goes, it kind of becomes a little bit more ludicrous, a little bit more contrived by the end. I think the ending is the most wild part of the movie. There's this whole, once you find out like kind of the paradigm that these cat people have to exist in, basically the woman decides that like, well, she wants to lose her virginity. And so she has sex with John Hurd, and he knows what the deal is with this. So he turns her into a black leopard, and he works at a zoo. He's like a zoo caretaker or whatever. And he puts her in a cage, and then that's where she is forever. Because the only way to transform back into a person is to kill someone. And she doesn't want to be involved in that cycle. So like I said before, part of the story being about breaking generational cycles. Like we've talked about a lot on this show, the movies I've been watching, a lot of it is about generational trauma and breaking cycles of violence. For here, it's breaking the kind of the connection between sexual experience and violence that is kind of like in the background of society as we kind of navigate our psychosexual natures and our kinks and the things that we, the instinctual reasons why we want to have sex and mate, and the kind of animalistic quality to that, right? Sex is something that is even akin to something like the survival mechanism in a person. Like what we become to get these things, it can be kind of intense, and we get very guarded about it. And this, then because you have her in direct conflict with her brother, played by Malcolm McDowell, like I said, and he's the one that's kind of like the standard bearer. He's holding the torch for the family ways, for the ways of his race, and trying to get his sister to also engage in that. And part of that is so that their race survives, that they can have children and and have more cat people. Because if they don't, then their line is over. Their family lineage is done. And it kind of explores that stuff. I wish it explored it more. I wish it had been more explicit. If I had a criticism, like it's just the concept itself is it's crazy, right? It's really fantastical. It's really over the top. It's almost silly at times. I wish it was more. I wish it was crazier. And I wish they didn't kind of hold back everything until kind of the third act. That's when it kind of becomes the movie that you thought you were going to watch. And I would say the same thing, like I brought up the movie Wolf earlier. Wolf is very similar to that, where it's kind of almost like kind of boring up until the third act. This one I think is ultimately a better movie than Wolf. I don't know if that's because of Paul Schrader or just the audacity of kind of going in this direction, because Wolf is directed by Mike Nichols, and it's much more just about, it's about like patriarchy. It's about the male ego and instinctual natures and being like a wolf. That's what, Jack Nicholson's character is a guy that's like kind of he's part of a publishing company. He's really high up in this New York publishing company, and he kind of has lived his life that way anyways. And then once he gets bitten by the werewolf and starts having these experiences, he becomes even more like aggressive, and all of the things, all of his hidden life inside of himself starts to come out. And Cat People has a very similar kind of trajectory with the main characters. I wish it was, like I said, though, I kind of wish it had been like a little bit more hokey almost. I think it's almost like it takes itself slightly too seriously up until the end. The end, it decided like, okay, no, we're just going to be what we're intending to be. But like I said, to get there is just kind of a slog. And that's unfortunate, because if it had more of a direct kind of almost like slasher structure, I feel like it would have worked a lot better, because it would have been subversive and to the genre. It would have been subversive to that genre. In fairness, I got to give credit where credit's due. This was made in 1982, so it was kind of during where slashers had kind of just been formed a few years before. I mean, Halloween, Texas Chainsaw Massacre. I think I'm not even sure if like Friday the 13th had come out at this point, but so it was kind of a nascent thing. So I can understand them not really being keyed into that and wanting to make a more traditional movie in a certain way, because this feels like a studio movie of the era, though not a studio movie as we would see today. It does feel like something from the 70s, and it's very explicitly adult, and not just because of the sexual aspects, but about just the way the conversations flow out and the way that the story builds and the ebbs and flows. It does feel like very much so a movie for adults, and it's about you feeling clever for figuring out the obvious subtext. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I'm happy that it had more than just the surface level. Like the shitty version of this movie is called Sleepwalkers, directed by master of horror Mick Garris. Now, if you've seen Sleepwalkers, it's a Stephen King adaptation from the early 90s, and it's about kind of a similar thing, and it's just more overt. I don't think Cat People should have gone as far as Sleepwalkers, which is has no deeper message or meta narrative or anything like that. So Cat People is definitely working on a more intense, thoughtful level than something like Sleepwalkers, but it could have used a little bit of that gonzo gore, a little bit of that silliness in there, maybe not be so self-serious at times. Like if there was a little bit more of a sense of awareness about itself. But that's me. I'm kind of fan theorizing what I wish the movie was, but taking it on its own accord, respecting what it is, it's an okay movie. I think maybe it might be worth watching, especially if you're a big Paul Schrader fan. I really like Paul Schrader. And also just to kind of see a weird fantasy horror movie. I wish it was better, though. I do wish it was a little bit more overt. It would have been funny, not funny, but it would have been interesting if somebody like Clive Barker had taken this material on around when he made Hellraiser. Hellraiser, one of my all-time favorite movies, but I would have loved to have seen what somebody with Clive Barker's kind of instincts and thought processes would have done with this material. I think it would have been really interesting, actually. And it seems like something that would be right up his alley. So, yeah. So there you go. Those are my thoughts on 1982's Cat People. Oh, my goodness. What a movie. What an okay movie. I'm glad I finally got around to watching it, though. I've been meaning to watch it for like a couple years. And finally, I was just like, today's the day. This morning, I was like, oh, shit. I got to watch something. Popped it on. I'm not sad I watched it. I'm not saying that you're going to love it. I think most people are going to find it probably pretty mediocre. And, yeah. I don't know. I wonder if this had like production or post-production issues. I couldn't really find too much in the trivia. Sometimes, I'll watch a movie, I'll go do a little background research on it. It seems like there was a little post-production stuff, but I don't know to what extent, because this is something Paul Schrader has kind of struggled with his entire career, is people coming in and fucking with his movies in post-production and taking them away from him to various levels. And yeah, it's only been in the past few years where he's been more like had more, I don't know, freedom. I mean, famously, he directed, the original The Exorcist, the beginning, is the one that came out in the theater. But he had done a movie called Dominion, prequel to The Exorcist, which is all the same sets, all the same cast for the most part. And he shot a whole movie, and then the studio didn't like it, so they hired Rennie Harlan to come in and direct a completely different version of the same movie. Dominion is the better of the two, but I mean they're not great. But he's just dealt with this shit forever. So I think I'm curious to find out if there was anything kind of behind the scenes going on with cat people, because he's an aggressive guy. He likes to talk about aggressive political topics and culture and whatnot. I mean, Christ, have you ever seen Taxi Driver? I mean, that's a great example right there. American Gigolo, even. But yeah, so thanks for watching, everybody. Thanks for listening. If you would like to know more about Zoobox, if you want to keep up with everything Zoobox, there are links in the description for Facebook, for Instagram, for my personal Twitter. Also, if you'd like to make a request, if there's something you'd like to hear me talk about during these daily videos that I do, leave it in the comments. I'll put it on the list. All right, everybody, you have a good day.